Welcome back, friends. We're going to discuss now social mobility and stratification and the links that exist between these two different concepts. One might say that hardly any society on earth is considered completely egalitarian. And this is probably there's been no truer statement than this. But at the same time, it's also important to note that societies also do not remain static. So neither are they egalitarian nor are they static. They are dynamic and they have hierarchical differences which are embodied in social stratification. Now, what is social mobility? One of the big thinkers in social mobility is P.A. Sorkin, who is a Russo-American thinker. He was an early anti-communist and he mentored Talcott Parsons at Harvard University. So he comes up with this definition of social mobility, which states that the movement, usually of individual but sometimes of whole groups between different positions within the system of social stratification in any society, is called social mobility. This definition has been adopted by the Oxford Dictionary of Sociology, and it is derived from Sorkin's work in that field. And it can also be understood as social mobility is any transition of an individual, that's number one, social object, that's number two, and value from one social position to another. And between social positions, we can always contemplate that it could be vertical versus horizontal. It could be intergenerational mobility or intragenerational mobility. We'll come to a detailed discussion on this concept. And it can also be structural versus circulational mobility, which is something we will discuss in the next 5 or 10 minutes. But first, let's take into account Sorkin's definition, which speaks about transition of individual social object or value from one social position to another. So the transition of an individual, one can easily give an example as Anulom marriage, where a woman of a lower caste is allowed to marry an upper caste male. This has been part of Manusmriti for around 2000 years roughly, and is an established example. You can give this in your answers. At the same time, social object or value. What would be a social object? That's the question I'd like to raise. For example, the Union Jack, the English flag, which is sort of like this. The English flag, after India got independence, as a social object, it lost almost all meaning. So we see a downward social mobility, a downward vertical mobility with regards to a social object, in this case, the flag of England, which ceased to become a relevant symbol of this country after our independence. So we see the downward decline, the downward trend in its social mobility. It has socially degraded, or rather socially fallen. Finally, we have values. For example, after the Russian Revolution, many prior to the Russian Revolution, many Tsarist generals were high-ranking aristocrats. But that social group, because of the activities of the revolution, had been obliterated almost completely. And instead of birth, as in your nobility status, your personal merit was considered the most important thing. As a matter of fact, there was a Soviet a general called Tukhachevsky, whose father was a barrel maker. So that is something that never happened before, and that shows a change in values. Earlier, value was high birth, in other words, ascription, and now value has turned into achievement. And this is a perfect example. Tukhachevsky's example is perfect to illustrate intergenerational, vertical, upward social mobility. Let us proceed now with a pretty simple topic: intergenerational versus intragenerational mobility. One can easily tell, well, let's say, for example, one person's father was a laborer and his son cleared the UPSC. So that's a clear example of intergenerational social mobility. And intragenerational social mobility, one has n number of examples. The biggest cliche would be Dhirubhai Ambani, who purportedly used to work as a gas station attendant and then ultimately became a billionaire. So that is an example of intergenerational mobility. Next, let's come across to the idea of vertical versus horizontal mobility. At this point, I'd like you to recall what Dipankar Gupta said in the previous lecture, in which he said that there is multiple axes of vertical mobility within society, but there are also differentiation at the same level, at the same strata. For example, if you're HR manager at a company, or you are a finance manager at the same company deriving the same pay, you will be effectively at the same social strata. Let's say you are here, or if you are a foreman at one factory and then suddenly become a clerk within the same factory, same pay grade, then you're probably sitting here somewhere. So what Sorkin says is that there exists vertical mobility as shown by these arrows, and there's also horizontal mobility which is shown by these. And let's look at ascending or descending mobility, which is the two aspects of vertical mobility. He says ascending mobility has two forms: as an infiltration or movement of individuals of lower strata into an existing higher one. For example, if you're looking at medieval Indian history, you had this character called Hemu, who was basically he was just a grain trader under the Delhi Sultanate, and he rose all the way up to the rank of leading the armies of the Sultanate. So, as a matter of fact, he was the one who was facing the Mughals at the second battle of Panipat. So that's an example of a movement of individuals from lower strata to high strata. So he just went from a grain trader to effectively a proxy sultan leading his army. The second ascending mobility would be creation of a new group or insertion of a group into a higher stratum. This would be clearly illustrated again carrying on with the historical paradigm when the Mughals replaced the Suri or the Lodi Afghans at the Delhi Sultanate. So you had one form of nobility which was dominated by the Lodi Afghans, and overnight, as a result of losing a series of battles, that entire form of nobility was replaced by the Mughal elites who came from Fergana Valley or who came from Kabul, etc. Meanwhile, we have on a similar paradigm descending mobility, also known as social sinking. If the earlier form of ascending mobility is called social climbing, then this one is called social sinking. I think it's important to incorporate this jargon in your answers. Could add a lot of marks to you: social climbing and social sinking. You can keep alternating these terms so that you can linguistically intimidate your evaluator into giving you more marks. So here we are discussing descending mobility, and this is where the movement of individual from a higher social platform to a lower one exists. Best example, Bahadur Shah Zafar. He was a Mughal emperor. He was top dog where he used to live, especially in a political or a ritual hierarchy. But after the failure of the 1857 revolt, he was effectively turned into a prisoner and sent off to Rangoon, where he died a commoner and a penniless man. So this is a typical example of an individual sinking socially. Let's look at degradation of an entire social group. This will be an interesting example. As I mentioned earlier, there was a very close-knit group of Russian aristocrats who used to rule that country before 1917. And after the 1917 revolution, they were either murdered or exiled or forced to integrate into normal Russian society. This integration was often done by them changing their names. So you had a lot of people who descended from aristocratic backgrounds, and they had surnames which were different from normal Russian masses. So a very famous Russian general was called Oktyabrsky, and that was a name he actually adopted because he was an aristocrat and he wanted to fit into the post 1917 Soviet regime. So he abandoned his original surname, which was an aristocratic surname, and he took up the Oktyabrsky surname. And Oktyabrsky means belonging to the month of October, and he wanted to use that name to cement his links or to display his faithfulness towards the October Revolution. So Oktoberski is a nickname is a name that he took up. So you see, in 1917, the Russian aristocracy degraded as a whole social group. They were exiled. They were forced to go to England, to North America, to France, etc. So in conclusion, we can say that generally there are two forms of patterns: ascending, descending patterns of individuals, and that of groups. Now, perhaps a quantitative tool you could call this is Sorkin's evaluation of a society's social mobility through the side points of view of intensiveness and generality. Now, intensiveness basically, by intensiveness he means how much vertical mobility does a system have for an individual. I mean, can an individual go from a 1 on 10 to a 10 on 10? That's a very intensive system. Probably exists in the West right now. And then what's the generality? As in, okay, fine, we have individuals going from 1 on 10 in the social strata, 10 being the highest and 1 being the lowest, within perhaps their own lifestyle. And at the same time, we want to ask ourselves how many such individuals exist within society, and that is the generality. How often is it, how general and how ordinary is it to come across such individuals within a society? So you have intensiveness and generality as what Pitirim Sorkin has identified as two evaluative measures to see how a society is conducive to social mobility. Now, obviously, when we talk about generality, we're going to talk about absolute generality and relative generality. You could absolute would be how many, kitne aadmi the, how many people, how many individuals rose up the ranks during perhaps a generation or an intra-generational period, whichever time period you might take. Or you could also have a relative generality in the sense that how much of a percentage of the population has risen up the social strata. So how many individuals were there relative to the total population? So this individual, this absolute general mobility will have to be contrasted with this relative general mobility. And see, this will be purely a numerical figure, like, okay, fine, we have 50,000 people who have risen from rank 1 to rank 10 in society. And relative would be something like, okay, 10% of the population over their lifetimes has risen up. For example, I think a intergenerational study was carried out in Denmark. The name evades me so far, but they found that the people in Denmark who in 1980 were in the bottom 25% of Danish society, almost all of them by the 2000s has risen all the way up to the top 25% of society. Only about 5% of the people in the bottom 25% surveyed in 1980 were still in the bottom 25%. Many of them rose to the top. So that is a form of extreme generality. So it's very general, and also a great deal of intensiveness. So Sorkin would look at Denmark for the last 30-40 years and say, yes, it's a very socially mobile society. We have a person called Melvin Tuman who has his own interesting paradigm of social mobility. He feels that there's two forms of social mobility. And this is procedural. He looks at it from the process point of view as opposed to Sorkin, who kind of looks at it from an outcome point of view. If you look at structural mobility or forced mobility, this is due to changes in the economic structure or changes in the relations of production. For example, in a lot of Western societies, you would have seen blue-collar workers over the last 50 years automatically become white-collar workers because, well, there's not so much manufacturing and the service sector has taken over in the West. Similarly, you would have seen something slightly unsavory happening during the British Raj, where due to structural factors, in other words, the deindustrialization of Indian textile handicrafts and craftsmanship due to competition from English goods led to a large number of craftsmen turning to agriculture for their living. So that's an example of forced structural mobility downwards. So social sinking induced by structural factors. The other form would be circulational mobility, what Melvin Tillman calls true mobility. This is the mobility that occurs as a result of opening up of opportunities in systems to the kinds of people who had not such opportunities before. Now, we could see the abolition of slavery in 1863 in the United States as one such example. So, the entire commercial labor market was opened up to the recently freed slaves. So, as a result of opening up of opportunities in the system, in other words, abolition of slavery, you have these people who are entering the commercial labor market for the first time, and Tuman would call this circulational or true mobility. Let's proceed. So there's generally speaking a lot of generalizations that take place in which relatively industrial societies are characterized as open societies, which means that they have greater levels of social mobility, and your standard caste based or feudal based society is characterized as a society where there is a large degree of closure. In other words, there's lower social mobility. This is a broad generalization, and if you take the ideal types of the two, I mean, one would have a purely open society and a purely closed society, but that's not what we generally see. Everything seems to fall in a continuum between these two ideas, so much so that I think somebody should look into it and see whether it follows a bell curve or a standard standard distribution. So most societies will actually form in this medium level of social mobility, which is in this general region. As a matter of fact, even if you look at extremely closed societies, for example, one could argue that the caste system was by design extremely closed, but in practice it was generally a system that allowed some modicum of social mobility. So one does actually find ample shreds of evidence of social mobility in field studies, whereas if one looks at caste from an Indological perspective, it looks like aside from Anulom and a few other exceptions, there is almost no avenue for social mobility of an entire caste or perhaps even individuals. Anthony Giddens, as a matter of fact, points out something quite interesting. Wherever there is low social mobility, their caste solidarity and cohesion is very high. This is probably likely because of the fact that generations upon generations of people will belong to that same ascriptional group in a low mobility society, and in a high mobility society where mobility is high, solidarity and class cohesion will be kind of low, and which is actually observed in industrial societies to a very large extent. And this is probably because there's a lot of churn, there's a lot of mobility from one strata to the other, and it's a situation where in a closed society, you and your friends, and you would be friends with a person of your own social stature, and your grandfather would be friends of his grandfather, and so on till time immemorial. So in such a situation, solidarity and cohesion will be high. But if there's a churn if there's a churn in social strata in any direction, those same people won't inhabit the same category, the same shreni for a long period of time. Hence, there will be lower amounts of class solidarity, and we see this here in places such as let's take the Gangetic Plain as the typical example of where the caste system is most well established. Over there, caste solidarity seems to be quite high. So we can certainly agree with Anthony Giddens on this observation. Now here are just a few tippanis, really, nothing of nothing conceptual knowledge, but something you can embellish your answers with, to coerce a few extra marks from your teachers. So Parsons says mobility is a result of the process of differentiation in society and role filling by those who suit him the most. What perspective could he possibly be representing if he says something like this? And what could it be? I mean, think about it and ask yourself. Well, it's probably he's a functionalist, which is the correct approach, which is yes, that is what Parsons is in this context. Marx talks about a process of embourgeoisement which will weaken class solidarity. Now, embourgeoisment is the proliferation of social values reminiscent of middle class values, especially that of materialism. So Marx, remember, he wanted class struggle. He wanted the proletariat versus the capitalist class, and he said that if the proletariat is moved up and it accepts middle class values, then it will become de-radicalized and that will endanger the workers' revolution. So he warned against this process. As a matter of fact, if you think about it, during the Cold War, all of Western Europe and all the capitalist societies of North America, Australia, New Zealand, etc., they all, through the mechanism of the welfare state, provided enough benefits to raise their working class people up to middle class levels. And this was done to steal the thunder of the rather seductive concept of the class struggle. So if you actually de-radicalize the working class by bringing them through middle class, the chances of a Marxist rebellion among the masses is significantly reduces, and Marx warned against this. And I think this warning was heeded enough by the West, and it manifested itself in the form of the welfare state. Parkin and Dahrendorf speak of social mobility as a safety valve to quell frustrations. Now, one can look at an example of this when Ireland was colonized by the English. A large number of Irish moved to USA. As a matter of fact, all the Irish freedom fighters and troublemakers, where once the British caught them, they sentenced them to a small jail sentence and then gave them new identities and encouraged them to move off to USA. So that proved to be a safety valve to quell flared up frustrations among the Irish population. So this is an example of horizontal social mobility. Another famous safety valve example can be the formation of the Indian National Congress, where the English, after imposing income taxes in the, I think in the early 1870s, they needed to show that the taxes were being collected with some representation. So they helped form the Indian National Congress as a safety valve, as an outlet for frustrations among the Indian population, especially the wealthy Indian elites, whether they be princely state, the princes, or whether they be the capitalist class or the aristocrats. So, continuing upon Marx's concept of embourgeoisement, we have an English sociologist by the name of Goldthorpe, and he basically said that mobility in India is only among intermediate classes. And he carried out this affluent worker study in the 1960s, and he generally wanted to test Marx's idea of whether there was mass embourgeoisment among the working class in England in the 1960s. And his conclusion was that it wasn't really happening. Embourgeoisment was not happening on the ground. As a matter of fact, he concluded that embourgeoisment was only taking place in form of social mobility among intermediate classes. And this means the British middle class. So if you can actually compare this with what M.N. Srinivas says, that yes, there were mechanisms within the caste system for social mobility, but they were generally available to intermediate castes. So here we see that you can literally replace caste with class and get the same conclusion of M.N. Srinivas as with Goldthorpe in his 1960 study in England. So it appears that social mobility is something, this is the conclusion that we can derive, that is mostly available to the people in the middle class or the middle caste. And the middle class would to a large extent erode the almost complete domination of the upper class in England. But it wouldn't be the proletariat or the working class who would actually benefit that much. They would largely just languish at the bottom of the pyramid. This is what their observation was. And in sociology, generally speaking, you will often find quite contrary conclusions from effectively the same data. And this is a postmodernist problem that we'll always face. And it's better to just represent in your answers both sides of everything, as opposed to declare to the world that you're a lunatic and just pretend to be a far left or far right guy. As a matter of fact, it's actually far more safe to represent both sides of all arguments, rather, in just in case you get a evaluator who's a bit of a psychopath, and he might penalize you if you have the wrong inclination along the political spectrum. You can always, once you get selected, you can always become a radical later on. But during writing the exam, I would suggest that you pretend at least to be a moderate, so that once you take power, you can stifle, retard, and hold to jeopardy the development of this country. But for the time being, just pretend to be a moderate, responsible person who shows both sides of all arguments. Then finally, we have Dipankar Gupta, who I'm never tired of quoting this person. He effectively says that yes, you have vertical hierarchies, and perhaps there are different variants of different axes of vertical hierarchies. Let's say in the Weberian paradigm, you will have a class, prestige, and party, or class, status, and party, and these are forms of vertical stratification. Or in the paradigm of Pierre Bourdieu, you can have a stratification according to access to social capital, symbolic capital, economic capital, and whichever one we've left out. So there could be multiple vertical hierarchies, but there are also horizontal differentiations within these hierarchies. And Dipankar Gupta says that you got to look at this from a grid perspective. You can't just look at it from a north versus north, south, up, down perspective along a vertical axis. You got to take into account the horizontal differentiations that may come into play. For example, let's say a farmer in Punjab will have, let's say, who owns 10 acres of land, which is very valuable. He's up in the economic capital strata. The same person who owns 10 acres in, let's say, very dry place in India, let's say Marathwada, will not necessarily have the same amount of will not have the same amount of economic capital. However, both of them might be of the same social strata. They may possess the same social capital. Similarly, if a person who drives trucks in Ludhiana or Punjab or Haryana, if that person is somewhere along here, up here, down here in the economic capital level, but he moves to Canada and he makes a huge amount of money over there. He's moved along this axis up the economic ladder, but he still does not possess any symbolic capital. He's a trucker there and he's a trucker here. So it's an interesting situation when one has moved vertically on the capital point of view, but has actually not moved at all as far as the symbolic capital is that he possesses. He possesses the same symbolic capital. This profession has fairly low status in India, and it has a fairly low status abroad as well. So Dipankar says that, listen, we need to look at this thing from a very complex matrix point of view. And I would agree with it if I could actually figure out how to apply this on a day-to-day basis. But fortunately, in your exams, you won't have to face something more than what I'm saying. You can just verbatim write whatever I'm telling you. You'll get pretty good marks. So let's look at factors affecting mobility. Now, these will be a number of factors. We're going to go through them quickly, and we're going to see whether they enhance or whether they stifle mobility. Industrialization and urbanization increase mobility. It is directly proportional to mobility. Education is a mechanism of mobility. Hence, yes, it is amenable to social mobility. Social capital and social status, according to Giddens and Whatmore, say that it creates a monopoly of social capital, where the phenomena among those of higher positions is that of self-recruitment. That the upper class just recruits other members of the upper class to do to positions of power. I mean, you can look at the elite boarding schools of India. You can see this phenomena where somebody who passed out in the early 90s recruits some youngster who has just graduated out of college but went to the same school as him, And this is a pure example of elite self-recruitment, a phenomena that Giddens and Botmore have observed. And this generally this is inversely proportional to social mobility. So this actually kind of reduces social mobility. Well, environmental changes, in other words, disasters, you can look at it from the perspective of the Middle East migration crisis, where large amount of horizontal mobility emerged as a result of with the civil war there. Whether we can call it environmental or not is a different question altogether. We can look at social movements. Social movements, for example, let's say the social movements for advocating a higher ritual status for a certain caste. These have existed throughout Indian history. As a matter of fact, it is well recorded in the last 200 years. There was the Mahar movement, and there was also the Ezava movement under the in Kerala under the SND PY, which is an organization that effectively was lobbying for a higher ritual status for the Ezava population, which is the population of peasants and toddy tappers. And this SNDPY is the Sri Narayan Dharam Paripalan Yogam, an organization that argued for a higher status for them. As a matter of fact, the Mahar movement of the early parts of the 20th century led to them being recognized as a martial community among the English, so much so that a Mahar regiment was formed as a result of lobbying by the Mahars. So these two examples we can always take of the Ezavas and the Mahars, who lobbied hard via social movement, agitated to get higher socio-economic status. Let's look at the next one, law and constitution. Well, one example is Article 14, that provided almost instant overnight social mobility, at least in theory, to the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes of India. We can look at the physical features, and by this I don't mean some geographical or geological thing. I mean actually mean the physical features of people. For example, a lot of physical traits are closely associated with status structures within different societies. For example, in Rwanda we had the Hutu and the Tutsi, and the Belgian colonial government effectively created this division by taking the more European looking people and putting them in the category of Tutsi, and taking the more African looking people and leaving them in the category of Hutu, and the Tutsi were considered to be better and they were given more opportunities, etc. An even better example of this would be the country of Liberia, which was founded in the early 19th century by Americans, where what they did was that all the freed slaves were sent back to a part of West Africa known as Liberia, and Liberia became a form of pigmentocracy, as in although everybody was of African origin, if somebody had lighter colored skin, they were considered of a higher status as opposed to somebody who had darker colored skin and more African features. For example, African features would be pronounced brow, a relatively broad nose, etc. So we have social mobility based upon these physical features, which is quite interesting. And I think these two examples of Rwanda and Liberia will probably suffice in this context. Next is subjective factors. This is what Veblen wrote in his theory of the leisure class in 1899. So Veblen basically said that there's a lot of conspicuous consumption happening in society, and this conspicuous consumption is not because everybody is a connoisseur. It is because people are spending money to attain status. These are items of conspicuous consumption. You would probably not do these things when you're all alone. You will probably show off with smoking an expensive cigar or drinking expensive wine, etc. They are intended to show other people that you are of a higher status, and hence these goods, these items like champagne and yachts and things like that, and expensive cars and Bentleys and Mercedes were known as Veblen goods, after Thorstein Veblen, the economist who observed this phenomena for the first time. These are all subjective features. Whether Maruti 800 is better than a mentally, at least for normal purposes of going from point A to point B. It is highly subjective whether there is an actual difference. You can obviously turn to a technological level and say one is more technologically advanced, but for a instrumental purpose of transportation, they are effectively the same thing. And in this situation, I would like to point out that there were subjective mechanisms of evaluating people throughout history, even before conspicuous consumption came out. For example, the aristocratic Romans looked down upon the rural Romans who were, well, they were their country cousins, but they said that the difference between us and them is that aristocratic Romans know how to speak and read in Greek and know Greek literature and poetry, while the rural Romans did not know so. And what does this remind you of? This reminds you of the phenomena of the urbanized English speaking elite versus his country cousins who are generally conversing in vernacular. So these subjective factors certainly come into play. Political factors with regards to social mobility. Well, we can look at laws. Women's suffrage, which was enacted by the English roughly after World War One, so either 1918 or 1919. I place my bets on 1918 that this was enacted then, and this provided almost 50% of the English population with social mobility, because women were given the right to express their political opinions via voting. So they went from zero political capital to high amounts of political capital, and that increased their social mobility within a multi-dimensional grid matrix of mobility. Then there is the infamous 1901 survey of Herbert Risley. He effectively went about asking people what castes they were. This was this I think on either the second or the third census that India ever had, and some lower caste announced that they were higher castes. So this was one mechanism of social mobility. So if whatever caste you are, you get the paperwork right, and you convince the people taking the census that yes, you are of X or Y caste, and that effectively becomes a form of social mobility, because the written word is the law after all. And if you manipulated that, then you've succeeded. Another example of this would be the in Ladakh we had an agitation of Ladakhis who wanted to be classified as scheduled tribes. This happened in the early 90s, and they succeeded in doing so. So you could actually see the census method or the political agitation method as a means of social mobility. So they began to get more represented in government jobs after that point. Then we have an interesting phenomenon in India, the rise of Kanshi Ram, who was most famous for his association with the Bahujan Samaj Party, and he represented what he called was the Bahujan Samaj. Now, Bahujan Samaj means the society of the many, the polyglot or the poly identity society, where he said he represented the non-Dvijas, or the OBCs, the SCs and STs, the people who were overlooked or ostracized during the in the caste hierarchy. He ended up being CM of UP, and he was also godfather to one Mayawati. I'm sure you heard of her. So these are a few factors that affect social mobility, be it in the Indian context or in the non-Indian context. I like to give non-Indian examples because there's a lot less controversy involved in them. You can just write it down. People won't take it that personally. You can risk writing slightly riskier things, and also at the same time you won't hurt anybody's feelings, which is great. Plus, your answers will be different from the answers of the average person, so the evaluator will actually be entertained by what you're writing. So let's move on further. So K.L. Sharma talks about mobility in the caste system, and this is fairly straightforward. What he says, there were three forms of mobility: one of the individual, one of a minority of families, here they are, and one of the majority of groups of families. So mobility of an individual could be anulom or pratilom marriage, where one can change, a woman can change her caste status depending on who she marries, whether she marries a man of the higher or lower caste. Also, a Brahmin is likely to lose his status if he takes recourse of things that are unbecoming of a Brahmin. So this was probably an incentive to a negative incentive to maintain his castely behavior. Mobility of minority families would have been when Brahmanism spread to the Deccan and to souths of India. What happened was that they encountered fairly egalitarian tribes where there wasn't really a great deal of social stratification. So, to include them into the Brahmanical fold and to cement the position of tribal chiefs over the rest of their kinsmen, they were the tribal chiefs were given a higher caste. They were allocated a higher caste and they were thus incorporated into the caste system. So a minority of ruling class families were incorporated into a higher caste. This can also happen through the process of westernization and also Sanskritization, which brings us to the majority of mobility of majority groups. This is the kind of mobility which is corporate or collective in nature. In other words, it's not a minority of families, and it's not regarding a certain person. It is of the entire caste or the entire class moving up the caste hierarchy via the process of Sanskritization and Westernization, which is the two main tools by which this mobility is achieved. And as observed earlier, the intermediate castes of the four Varnas are the prime candidates. They are on pole position to increase or perhaps fall in the caste hierarchy using the tools of Westernization or Sanskritization. And an interesting point K.M. Panikkar raises is that the Nandas were the last two Kshatriyas. And if you think about it, the Nandas were around in 300 BCE, which is 2300 years ago, and the entire Kshatriya caste, the Rajanya or Kshatriya caste, was generally occupied by non-Kshatriyas at this point onwards. So we see people like the Huns or the Rajputs or the Shakas and the Kushans and the Indo-Parthians. These castes were often inducted into the position of the Rajanya. As a matter of fact, there is a famous theory of Rajputization. So often these people are given Rajput status and made surrogates for the defeated or the vanquished Kshatriya caste. So this is an interesting observation. Now let's get down to the fun part. The fun part is looking at stratification from various perspectives. So we look at it initially from the functional perspective, later on the Marxian perspective, and perhaps sooner or later we'll compare the two. But let's just look at what the functionalists have to say, because they have a lot to say. They say that people are motivated on two levels. They need to fill certain positions and they need to perform duties attached to certain positions. And that in any society there are roles that have to be performed that an ordinary person cannot always be trained or does not have the natural ability to carry out, and hence they have to be differential treatment and differential rewards for these people who carry out these extremely difficult tasks. For example, in a pure meritocracy, let's say you were running Hindustan Unilever or some other very large company, you would have almost no personal life. You would be working maybe 80, 70, 100 hours a week, and you would have no time for your wife and children or family life, etc. So stratification is necessary to fulfill these positions with intelligent, industrious people who can perform the duties attached to such positions. And to motivate the people to perform such roles, you need rewards, and rewards are built into these positions, so that these have been evolutionarily built in. They're inducements, as a matter of fact. So a general in an army does not necessarily need to get saluted every time his men approach him, but it is a form of giving honor. It's a social reward because his job is rather difficult, and not everybody has the temperament, the training, or the skill to perform that job. And social inequality is actually a functional thing. It is actually something that is inevitable in society, it is universal in society, and it is functional for collective survival. So if society needs proper leadership and it needs people to fulfill these roles, then they have to give them differential rewards. Now, what do these rewards look like? These are rewards that society has at its disposal to distribute among people unequally according to the roles that they occupy in society. So the first thing would be, well, things that contribute to sustenance and comfort. So in other words, if you look at Maslow's hierarchy, the bottom two, the physiological needs and the safety needs, are here. So let's say, if you clear the UPSC and you're given a chauffeur driven car or a government house, then these are rewards that are contributing to your sustenance and comfort. They allow you to be comfortable in the little Sarkari house with your 100 servants, and you can do your work properly, and it is social validation. The other thing that the other reward that society can give you is to humor and divert you. In other words, to entertain you. So, कल आप select हो गए तो subordinates की चापलूसी तो आपने enjoy ही करनी है, and some of that चापलूसी, some of that sycophancy can be quite funny and very very entertaining, I'm told. So one of the greatest social rewards is the reward of humor and diversion, as manifested in the government sector by sycophancy of entertaining subordinates. Yes. Further on, then there are things that society gives you which allot to you self-respect and ego expansion. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the general in the army is always given a salute, and this increases. This is a social reward, and it increases his self-respect and leads to expansion of his ego, which can be quite a good feeling. Further on, a lot of awards and medals are given to people. Padma Bhushan, Padma Vibhushan, Vidma Bhushan, Padma Bhushan. I mean, all sorts of combinations of these awards are given to people, which contribute to this third category of reward, which leads to self-respect and ego expansion. So much so that when you read a lot of government paperwork, you see that high-ranking bureaucrats are given unofficial titles like the learned principal secretary, or the worthy commissioner has noted that worthy commissioner has noted this, that, and the other. So these items end up leading to self-respect and ego expansion, and these are social rewards because you are filling roles that society deems to be important. That's number one, that not everybody can do because not everybody has the credentials, the training, the temperament to do such jobs. And finally, these jobs are important. Somebody must do them. And that is the entire structural functional perspective behind social stratification, that this is a very important thing. The survival of society at large is dependent upon social stratification. In other words, inequality is functional for collective survival. I mean, just look at two determinants of positional rank. The best reward and the highest rank are awarded to those positions which are very important for society and require the greatest exercise or talent or dexterity. Now look at a person like Sachin Tendulkar. That you cannot put a price on the talent and dexterity that man had, and he provided a very important service for society. In other words, he provided an excellent diversion form of good cricket and excellent sportsmanship, and this is something that gave a lot of people a lot of comfort, and society valued his talents to such an extent that he was rewarded with all sorts of social rewards. I mean, you can go down and look at all these awards of sustenance and comfort, where he got a lot of money. Um, he was humored and given a lot of diversion by society. In other words, he was invited to a lot of parties, and he had a lot of fans, and a lot of people liked him. Whenever they saw him, they would get his autograph, etc. And he also won several awards for the country, which led to his self-respect and ego expansion. So we have somebody here in an easily relatable example of Sachin Tendulkar, where he's providing an important role for society. This is subjective. Society itself decides what is important and what is not important. If cricket is important and hockey isn't, then that is the choice of society. And few people could do what he could do. As a matter of fact, maybe no one could do what he could do. And this resulted in unequal rewards for Sachin Tendulkar. And this is functional for society in the long run. That's what the structural functionalists insist on telling us. When you're talking about structural functionalism, and in the context, structural functionalism's perspective on social stratification, it's important to mention Davis and Moore, especially Kingsley Davis. You can actually sort of whatever examples that I've given you, you can just Gusau, Davis and Moore into those examples. You can just shoehorn them in and say कि हाँ Davis and Moore have said that social stratification is functional, and it's inequality is functional for collective survival. It's inherent and it's unavoidable, and it's a system of positions and not on the position occupied by individuals. So you can always quote Davis and Moore. Kingsley Davis is a very interesting person. He, as a matter of fact, worked at the Hoover Institution, which is a think tank that is an American think tank, which is a conservative public policy think tank. And generally speaking, any conservative point of view will insist on the importance of hierarchy. Anything left-leaning will, any think tank or any person who's left-leaning will generally say, well, hierarchy is, they'll either say it's a necessary evil, or they will say that, oh man, it's a tool of oppression. So it's best to understand these broad generalizations at this point, so that you're not lost at sea later on. So let's look at the criticisms of structural functionalism's perspective on stratification. Melvin Tubman is one who comes across this idea, and he basically says that he has generally criticized Davis and Moore, the two people I just mentioned earlier, and his criticism generally revolves around technicalities in their work, as in he would point out some very obscure shortcomings in their work, but largely his concept rotated around his assertion that Davis and Moore, they justified stratification rather than explained it. They were more proponents of stratification as opposed to people who found out why and how stratification happened. So he sees them as champions of stratification, people who are trying to justify the existing system. Then we have Ralph Dahrendorf, who says that, well, stratification is a great mechanism of social control based upon positive and negative sanctions. In other words, positive or negative reinforcement mechanisms that keep people in line and force conformity upon them, and that all deviation from the mechanism of from the ideals of conformity are always punished by society. So he looks at it at social stratification as a stifling item, as opposed to something that actually gives people more freedom. He says that people are stifled by it. Wilson and Pickett say that inequality in society is not only harmful but is also dysfunctional, and he's got a point here. Unequal societies have high levels of mistrust. I mean, the corruption perception index of Pakistan is very, very high. At the same time, it is one of the most unequal societies in the world. And the corruption perspective index of any Scandinavian country is very low. And it's one of those societies that is near egalitarian. So one can take this broad generalization and see what Wilson and Pickett are talking about in this context. Johnson Turner, there's no need to remember his name. All you need to remember is that functional theories suffer from illogical teleologies, in other words, cyclic explanations. Every time somebody wants you to criticize something that a structural functional theory, always put this example of illegitimate teleologies, illogical teleologies. What does this mean? This is a confusion between cause and effect, that a system exists, hence that system must be functional. And whatever function it creates contributes to its existence. And if it exists, it must be functional. And whatever function it does contributes to its existence. So So what we're saying is that functional theories have cyclical explanations which are not convincing explanations. Just because something exists does not necessarily mean that it has a function. And that's the problem with structural functionalists, that they often see a system and they say, well, there must be some reason why it exists. There must be some function. And then they work backwards and find all sorts of justifications of the system based upon real or imaginary functions that are being carried out by it. So this is one of the most legitimate criticisms of any functional theory, and I would suggest wherever possible, put this in your answers. Then we have the perspective of W.L. Warner. This is an American anthropologist and sociologist. He was active in the 1940s. Just remember, anybody in the 1940s to 1960s who did any form of fieldwork is one of those hybrid anthropologist sociologist specimens. He's half anthropologist, half sociologist. And W.L. Warner is one of them. As a matter of fact, he brought the tradition of British structural functionalism to USA from England, and this was based upon the works of Malinowski and A.R. Radcliffe Brown. These both were Englishmen who were anthropologists, and they did a lot of ethnographic research, and they are generally known as structural functionalists or just functionalists. As a matter of fact, Malinowski was born in Poland but studied most of his life in England, and he lived among many tribes in the Pacific, etc., observing their behavior very closely, as did Radcliffe Brown. And the methodologies for ethnography that they created were a big influence on Warner. And what Warner did was he studied American neighborhoods, and he wrote a brilliant book called Yankee City. And in Yankee City, he divides American society into 9 strata. So these are the upper, middle, and lower classes. And each of them had an upper, middle, and lower class. So you can see the upper class would exist, the upper middle class, the middle upper class would exist, the lower upper class would exist, and by that mechanism he identified 9 total social strata. And he said that he was kind of a functionalist in the sense that these social strata, people living within them, used people who were in the same strata as reference groups, and this allowed them to have realistic expectations of life. You cannot have according to Warner, he said, you cannot have a lower class person being friends with an upper class person and having the same dreams and aspirations as these two. And this regulated, they cannot be each other's reference groups. And he said that this provides, this limited reference group system provides a certain amount of stability to American society. And he expanded upon this in his book Yankee City. And in another paradigm that he emphasized, he said that social status is defined by education, income, occupation, and friendship / membership of voluntary groups and leisure activities. So education, naturally, this is self-explanatory that social status differs from person to person based on education. Somebody who's uneducated will not have the same status of somebody who's, say, a doctorate in physics, or somebody who works at ISRO. Income, this is self-explanatory also, that social status is determined by how much money you earn. Occupation, some occupations are inherently noble. For example, wherever you go, a doctor is always honored. A doctor is considered, his job is considered one of the most honorable professions on earth. During times of war, a soldier's profession is considered one of the most honorable. A soldier and officer's profession is considered more honorable. At the same time, there's always these classifications of people whose status is always, irrespective of which society, is always kind of low. These would be, in the West, you would have people like, professional gamblers. Their occupation is generally considered of a low status. And then finally, friendship or membership of voluntary groups and leisure activities. For example, one great pressure group is one great indicator of your social status is what leisurely activities do you do? Do you play gilli danda on the street or do you play golf with the chief minister? So these leisure activities that you carry out in your free time are indicators of social status. So Warner finally enumerated four of these: education, income, occupation, and membership of voluntary groups or leisure activities or friendship. In other words, आप किसके दोस्त हो, आप किसको जानते हो. This also reflects in your social status. Coming down to the functional perspective in Indian studies, generally we've seen from Herbert Risley to Hutton to G.S. Ghurye to M.N. Srinivas to Louis Dumont, all of these people generally enumerated the positive functions of caste by praising its organic character and praising its inter-caste dependence, intra-caste solidarity, and a very strong functionalist perspective generally pervaded Indian studies of social stratification. And before independence, as a matter of fact, maybe up to the 50s and 60s, till Marxist perspectives started coming into Indian sociology, these were accepted without demur. So they were considered to be the mainstream thought. Next, we're going to look at Marxist perspectives on stratification. This is a lot of fun because wherever there's conflict, there's a lot of fun. This will be the topic of our next lecture. Take care.